Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive with us. And today we're going deep into 80s horror.
Oh, yeah.
Specifically, Friday the 13th, Part 6, Jason Lives. Now you guys have sent over a ton of reviews, articles, behind-the-scenes info about this one.
Yeah.
So clearly this is a fan favorite that you want us to really get to the bottom of.
Yeah.
And lucky for us, we've got a true horror expert here to help unpack it all.
Happy to be here.
So before we get into the nitty-gritty,
Huh.
can you just give us a little bit of context for anyone who might not be
Yeah.
a diehard Friday the 13th fan?
Yeah. So Jason Lives came out in 1986.
Mhm.
And at that point, the series was starting to feel a little bit stale. You know,
Yeah.
you already had 5 films of Jason just hacking and slashing his way through teenagers. And the formula was getting a little bit predictable. But Jason Lives did something really interesting. They shook things up quite a bit. And one of the biggest changes was how they brought Jason back.
Ah, yes, the infamous resurrection scene.
Yeah.
This isn't just your typical he's back kind of sequel. We're talking full-on supernatural revival here. I mean, what was your reaction to seeing Jason brought back by a bolt of lightning?
Well, you know, I thought it was a stroke of genius. It
Yeah.
just injected this whole new level of energy and mythology into the franchise. Suddenly, Jason wasn't just this hulking killer, you know.
Yeah.
He was an unstoppable supernatural force. And even that tagline, he's back, and he's got company. I mean, that perfectly captures the tone of the film, this self-aware kind of meta humor. It's like they knew exactly what they were doing. They were winking the audience, acknowledging the absurdity of it all, but still delivering those scares.
Okay, so we've got a supercharged Jason. We've got a tagline that winks at the audience. But what about our hero, Tommy Jarvis?
Yeah.
You sent over a lot of material that really focuses on him. So what makes him such a compelling character?
Well, Tommy is really interesting because he's not your average hero. I mean, this is the guy who killed Jason as a kid.
Yep.
Back in Final Draft. And now he's totally consumed by this fear that Jason might still be alive somehow. It's this obsession that leads him to dig up Jason's grave, which, of course, inadvertently causes this whole resurrection mess.
It's like a horror version of Be Careful What You Wish For.
Yeah.
He's so fixated on making sure that Jason stays dead that he ends up bringing him back to life. What do you make of that irony?
I think it's brilliant. You know, it adds this whole psychological layer to the story. Tommy isn't just battling Jason. He's battling his own inner demons, his own trauma, and it really blurs those lines between hero and monster. You know, is Tommy really the good guy here? Or is his obsession turning him into something else?
That's such a great point. And I think that's something that really resonates with a lot of horror fans. You know, there's this underlying question throughout the entire film. Who's the real monster here?
Exactly. And that's something that director Tom McLaughlin really plays with.
Speaking of McLaughlin, what can you tell us about his vision for this film? It just feels so different from the previous installments. It's a little bit more self-aware, a little funnier.
Well, McLaughlin was a huge fan of those classic Universal horror films. And he really wanted to bring that sense of gothic atmosphere and dark humor to the Friday the 13th franchise. I think he understood that audiences were getting tired of the same old slasher formula, so he injected a lot of wit and self-awareness into the script.
Did you feel like that approach worked? Did it make the film scarier or more entertaining?
I think it did both. You know, the humor doesn't undermine the scares. It actually enhances them by acknowledging the absurdity of it all. McLaughlin is able to create these moments of genuine tension and suspense. Take, for example, the paintball massacre scene.
Oh, yeah, that scene is a perfect example of what we're talking about. It's so brutal, but it's also hilarious. What do you think makes that scene work so well?
Well, it's the contrast. You've got these unsuspecting teenagers out for a fun day of paintball, and then you've got Jason, this unstoppable killing machine, using a paintball gun as a weapon. It's both shocking and funny. And it's just a great example of how McLaughlin subverts expectations.
It's interesting, too, how he connects that scene back to Jason's origin story. You see the kids wearing those hockey masks, which is a clear reference to Jason's iconic look, which, of course, stems from his childhood trauma of drowning at Camp Crystal Lake.
Right. It's those little details, those clever nods to the franchise's past that make Jason Lives so much fun to watch. McLaughlin clearly had a deep understanding of the material, and he wasn't afraid to play with it.
Okay, so we've talked about the supernatural elements, the humor, the clever nods to the past. But what about the kills? This is Friday the 13th film, after all.
Of course.
Were there any that stood out to you?
Oh, there are so many good ones in this film. Jason Lives really ups the ante in terms of gore and creativity. From the infamous sleeping bag kill to that heart-punching scene, McLaughlin doesn't shy away from the brutality. But it's never gratuitous, you know? It's always in service of the story and the character.
I'm curious, for those who are a little bit squeamish about gore, is there still something to appreciate in this film?
Oh, absolutely. The kills are definitely a big part of the appeal. But it's not the only thing Jason Lives has going for it. I mean, the characters are surprisingly well developed, especially Tommy Jarvis.
Speaking of Tommy, I want to circle back to him for a second. He's a survivor, but he's also clearly haunted by his past. What did you think of his performance in this film?
I think Tom Matthews does a fantastic job portraying Tommy's inner turmoil. You really see the fear and the anger in his eyes.
Yeah.
And you believe that he's carrying the weight of his past trauma. It's a performance that elevates this film beyond your typical slasher flick.
Yeah, I agree. You really empathize with him. Even when he's making those questionable decisions and that final confrontation with Jason at the lake, that is such a powerful moment.
Oh, absolutely. It's just beautifully shot. And it really brings Tommy's arc full circle.
So we've covered a lot of ground here.
Yeah.
But there's still so much more to unpack. What are some other aspects of Jason Lives that you think are worth diving into?
I think it's worth looking at the impact that this film had on the franchise as a whole. Jason Lives didn't just revitalize the series, it really set a new standard for, what, a Friday the 13th film?
Yeah.
Could be.
You're right. This one really pushed the boundaries. I mean, it established Jason as a truly supernatural entity.
Right.
Which really opened the door for all those crazy sequels that came after.
Right.
You know, Jason in Space, Jason in Manhattan.
Exactly. Jason Lives embraced that absurdity, that over-the-top nature of the premise. And that became a hallmark of the later films. It's like they finally realized that taking themselves too seriously just wasn't working.
And that humor that we were talking about.
Yeah.
I mean, that became a key ingredient in the Friday the 13th formula from this point forward.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the reasons why Jason Lives continues to resonate with audiences today. It's a fun, self-aware horror film that doesn't take itself too seriously.
It's interesting how the tone of the series really shifted with this installment. You know, the earlier films definitely had their moments of dark humor, but Jason Lives really leans into it. Do you think that reflects a broader change in horror cinema in the 80s in general?
Oh, definitely. The mid-80s saw the rise of a new kind of horror, one that wasn't afraid to wink at the audience, to embrace the campiness of the genre. You know, think about films like A Nightmare on Elm Street or Evil Dead 2. They blend horror and humor in a way that's both terrifying and entertaining.
It's like horror filmmakers were acknowledging the tropes and the cliches of the genre, but still finding ways to scare the pants off of us.
Exactly, and I think that's part of the appeal of Jason Lives. It's a film that's both a tribute to and a subversion of the slasher genre.
Okay, but let's talk about the technical aspects for a minute. You know, you sent over some behind-the-scenes information.
Yeah.
And I'm curious to know your thoughts. On the filmmaking itself, how did they achieve that blend of humor and horror, visually speaking?
Well, I think Tom McLaughlin really understood how to use visuals to create both tension and humor. For example, the way he frames certain shots using shadows and Dutch angles creates this sense of unease and dread. But then he'll cut to a close-up of Jason doing something ridiculous like putting on sunglasses. And it just completely undercuts the tension. It makes you laugh.
So it's all about that balance.
Yeah.
That's that juxtaposition of the terrifying and the absurd.
Right.
What about the special effects? I mean, they hold up surprisingly well for an 80s film.
Oh, the practical effects. And Jason Lives are top-notch. The gore is realistic and gruesome, and it's all done with practical effects, which gives it a certain rawness and authenticity that you don't always get with CGI.
I remember reading that they went through gallons of fake blood.
Oh, yeah. Gallons and gallons. And they used a lot of creative techniques to make those kills as memorable as possible. For example, in the sleeping bag kill, they used a dummy filled with animal organs to achieve that realistic splattering effect.
Ugh. It's both disgusting and impressive.
Yeah.
It's clear that they put a lot of care and attention into making those kills as impactful as possible.
They did, and I think that attention to detail is really what elevates Jason Lives above a lot of other slasher films. It's not just about mindless violence. There's a real craftsmanship to the filmmaking.
And that craftsmanship extends to the score as well. The music in this film is incredibly effective. It's creepy, it's atmospheric, and it really enhances the suspense.
It does. Harry Manfredini, who scored most of the Friday the 13th films, really outdid himself on this one. He created a score that's both haunting and memorable.
And it's interesting how he uses those familiar cues from the previous films, like the iconic ki 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 ma 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 sound. But he also introduces these new themes that reflect the film's darker, more supernatural tone.
Right. It's just this brilliant score that perfectly complements the visuals and the story. It's one of those horror scores that really stays with you long after the film is over.
Okay, so we've talked about the director's vision, the technical aspects, the impact on the franchise, but we haven't really touched on the critical reception. How was Jason Lives received when it was first released?
Well, it was a huge box office success. It became one of the highest grossing films in the franchise at the time. Audiences loved it, and critics were generally pretty positive. They praised the film's humor, its energy, and its fresh take on the series.
So it sounds like Jason Lives really struck a chord with both fans and critics. Why do you think that is?
I think it's because the film managed to do something that's very difficult. It revitalized a tired franchise without betraying its roots. It brought something new to the table while still delivering that classic Friday the 13th experience that fans had come to expect.
It's such a delicate balance. You want to keep the core elements that make the franchise work, but you also need to introduce those new elements to keep things fresh and engaging.
And Jason Lives did that brilliantly. They embraced the absurdity, the humor, the supernatural elements, and it all just worked perfectly. It's a film that's both a tribute to and a subversion of the slasher genre.
It's like they said, okay, we know what you love about Friday the 13th.
Yeah.
But here's something a little different, a little more fun, a little more self-aware.
Yeah.
And it worked.
It did. And I think that's why Jason Lives remains such a fan favorite today. It's a film that's both nostalgic and fresh, both terrifying and hilarious.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the plot, the characters, the filmmaking, the impact on the franchise, the critical reception. But there's one thing we haven't addressed yet, and it's something you specifically highlighted in your notes, the ending.
Yes. The ending of Jason Lives is one of the most memorable and thought-provoking in the entire franchise.
It definitely leaves you with a lot to think about. So for those who haven't seen the film, without giving too much away, what makes this ending so special?
Well, it's ambiguous. For one thing, we see Jason chained to the bottom of Crystal Lake, seemingly defeated. But that final shot of the film zooms in on Jason's open eye, suggesting that he might not be as dead as we think.
Right. It's that classic horror trope of leaving the audience with a sense of unease, a lingering doubt.
You think the threat is gone, but then the film reminds you that evil never truly dies.
Exactly.
And it perfectly captures the cyclical nature of the Friday the 13th franchise. No matter how many times you killed Jason, he always seems to find a way to come back.
It's like that line from the film. Some folks have a hard time dying. I guess old Jason's one of them.
Yes. That's a brilliant line that sums up the entire premise of the franchise.
But it's not just about Jason's potential return. The ending also raises questions about Tommy Jarvis.
It does.
I mean, what's going to happen to him? Has he finally conquered his demons? Or will he be forever haunted by the memory of Jason?
That's the question, isn't it? The ending suggests that Tommy's ordeal might not be over. He's physically survived. But has he mentally and emotionally escaped the trauma of his encounters with Jason?
It's a question that lingers long after the credits roll. And I think it's one of the reasons why Jason Lives is such a compelling and enduring film. It's not just a mindless slasher. It's a film that explores themes of trauma, obsession, and the cyclical nature of violence.
Right, and it does so with a healthy dose of humor and self-awareness. It's a film that knows how to entertain, while also giving you something to think about.
Okay, so after all this discussion, after diving deep into Friday the 13th, Part 6, Jason Lives, it's time for the big question. What is your rating out of 5?
For me, Jason Lives is a solid 4.5 out of 5.
Wow, 4.5, it's high praise. It's a near-perfect blend of horror humor. And just really clever filmmaking. I mean, it revitalized the franchise, introduced some really iconic kills, and gave us a truly compelling character in Tommy Jarvis. I think I'm right there with you. I'm going to go with a 4 out of 5. It's just such a fun movie to watch. And it really holds up all these years later. Plus, it gave us that incredible final shot of Jason underwater.
Yes.
Which I think is one of the most chilling images in the entire franchise.
Oh, absolutely. That final shot is pure brilliance. It just perfectly encapsulates the film's themes and leaves you with this sense of dread that lingers long after the credits roll.
So we've dissected this film from every angle. But I always like to leave our listeners with something to ponder. What's one key takeaway you'd want someone to have after experiencing Jason Lives for the first time?
Well, I think the key takeaway here is that even a tired franchise can be revived with a fresh perspective and a willingness to embrace the absurd. You know, Jason Lives to really prove that you can have fun with horror without sacrificing the scares.
That's a great point. It's a reminder that sometimes The best horror comes from those unexpected places. And speaking of unexpected, we want to hear from you. What did you think of Jason Lives? Did it live up to the hype? Did you find Tommy Jarvis to be a sympathetic character? Head over to the comments and let us know your thoughts.
And while you're there, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into your favorite horror films and pop culture phenomena.
Until next time, keep exploring, stay curious, and remember, sometimes the most terrifying things are the ones that we bury deep down inside.